Okay, and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the Maya. The Maya are such a big topic, we have to break the lecture into three parts. The first part, this lecture, is going to introduce the Maya and their principal belief systems and their culture, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the Preclassic Maya, and then in the next lecture we'll talk about the Classic Maya, and finally in the third lecture we'll round out the Post-Classic or Terminal Classic Maya and their relationship to the cultures of the Mexican Basin, principally Tula and the Toltecs. So we're going to start out talking about Mayan geography, a little bit about Mayan chronology, a little about the historiography of the Mayan, how we have understood them and how that impression may have changed, and then we're going to break down several major features of Mayan culture. So when we talk about Mayan geography, we're basically talking about this region here. Everything south of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, all the way down to about Nicaragua. There are Mayan sites in El Salvador, Honduras, and Belize, but mostly we're going to be talking about Mexico and Guatemala. Those are the heartlands of where the Maya are located. And we have three principal regions that we have Mayan finds. We have the southern lowlands, we have the southern highlands in Mexico and Guatemala, and then we have the northern lowlands. And they also correspond roughly to the chronology of the Maya. So all of the earliest Mayan sites, the pre-classic sites, are going to be located in the Petén region. This is this region of Guatemala that juts up towards the Yucatan. El Mirador, Nakbe, San Bartolo are all in that area, and we're talking somewhere around the area of 300 to 100 BCE. Then we enter into the classic phase. This is the golden age of the Maya, where we have the most sites, the most architecture, all of these rival city-states just competing for resources and trying to outcompete each other with art and temples. And that's going to be principally in the southern lowlands, expanded out, but also reaching out to the highlands as well. And then finally, we have a collapse. And with the collapse, we see a very pronounced change in Mayan civilization. In many ways, this phase of Mayan civilization is every bit as big as the classic period, but it's different. Stylistically, it changes, and the biggest thing is it moves north into the Yucatan, and all of the southern sites are pretty much abandoned and reclaimed. So when we look at these regions, particularly the southern lowlands, I think the thing that we really need to know about it is that it is a very dense rainforest. Now, the Mayan would have cleared much of this forest away to plant corn and to plant crops, and all of these temples that have been consumed by the rainforest, of course, would have been maintained. But once the society collapsed, you can easily see how they were just consumed by the jungle. This is some of the densest forest you've ever seen in your life. It is really crazy. I thought the forests in Pennsylvania were dense, but they got nothing on the forests in Guatemala. You really can't see much more than about 50 yards in any direction, and you can easily get lost and turned around. There's no monuments or anything, so you really need to know your way around it. Even today, people get lost in it all the time. So if you go down there looking for ruins or stuff, please go with an accredited guide and make sure you know where you're at. It's a little different in the highlands. The highlands are also rainforest, but they're a little bit more broken up by topography. We have a little bit more colder weather. We also have quite a few volcanoes and other features as well. More rivers and more streams. It's not just pure rainforest. The Yucatan is different again. I wish I had a picture of what the forest in the Yucatan looks like, because it's far more open. There's a lot more detritus on the forest floor. It's not so dense. And although it's pretty dense, I mean, come on, we live in Utah, 2 trees together is a rainforest here, but it's a little different. But it's different because it's a much drier area. It gets much lower rainfall than the southern lowlands, and there are no major rivers or streams. And so you may ask, well, how is it so green? Well, it's green because of sinkholes. This is karst topography. You have these limestone caverns that collapse and produce sinkholes, and they're naturally fed by underwater springs and groundwater. These are called cenotes, and they are sacred places. To the Maya, they mark openings and passages to Xibalba, the underworld. And now today they're just, party places for tourists, but they guarantee that you have this very kind of lush environment, despite the fact that it's relatively dry in the Yucatan. Of course, the Yucatan borders on the Caribbean, so you have gorgeous coastlines like this. You also get Caribbean breezes, so again, it tends to be much less humid, much less dense than the southern lowlands. Maybe you can understand why they moved there after the collapse. So when we talk about Mayan chronology, we have these three basic periods. You have the pre-classic or formative period. This is the period leading up to the classic period, and is at the tail end of where the Olmec were and kind of overlaps with the last days of the Olmec and the Zapotec cultures in Monte Alban. It also overlaps with the high point of Teotihuacan. Then you get into the classic period. The classic period is the period of the great cities, Copan, Tikal, Calakmul, Yaxchilan, Piedras Negras. There's just so many of them. Dos Pilos. It goes on and on and on and on. There's so many of these sites, and every one of them is just covered in inscriptions and stelae and sculpture and pyramids. It's really quite amazing. We sometimes break this up into various different periods. The high point is going to be those last 300 years, between the years 600 and 900. And then somewhere around the year 900, poof. And I really do mean poof. We have no idea what happens. It just kind of ends. They walk away from the southern lowlands, and all the temples are consumed by the jungle, and they never reoccupy them. That's why there's so many ruins in the area. And so there's some kind of collapse to society. What causes this is very complex. We'll talk about it more in detail when we get to the end of the classical period. But then we enter into the post-classic period. So because archaeologists and Mayanologists were so fascinated by this classic period, that's why we call it the classic period. It's the style that defines what we think of as Mayan. And the post-classic period is everything past that. This is the period where they move up into the northern lowlands, into the Yucatan, into that karst topography with all the sinkholes and cenotes. And this is where we have things like Chichen Itza, Tulum, Uxmal, and many of these other sites. What's interesting is we have a huge change in style that happens as well. We go from a more curvilinear, organic, naturalistic style to a much more geometric style that many people think is being influenced from the Mexican basin. So it's quite a dramatic shift, but we still have this flourishing of culture. And then it too comes to an end somewhere around the year 1300. I know if you've ever seen the Mel Gibson movie Apocalypto, the Apocalypto is... well, okay, let me put it this way. There's not many Mesoamerican movies for people to enjoy. When I finished one of my first Mayan classes, we all got together and had a movie night, and we watched Road to El Dorado and Apocalypto on the same night. And then we all just sat there as, students picking it apart, talking about how bad it was. Basically, the problem with those movies is they take 1,000 years of history and just cram it all together. It's the same thing as the Middle Ages, as they put armor and buildings that couldn't have existed in, hundreds of years apart and smash them all together. History, it will ruin your enjoyment of entertainment forever. Remember that. History will ruin your enjoyment of entertainment forever. So at the end of Apocalypto, there's this scene where the hero sees these Spaniards rowing ashore. And, of course, the Spaniards are going to come into contact with all these Mayan temples and pyramids and etc. and decadent civilization. All fake. Never happened. All of those temples were abandoned for centuries before the Spaniards ever arrived. So why did the second collapse happen? Again, we don't know. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there. So Mayan civilization is a civilization we really know predominantly through archaeology. Almost, the Aztec civilization was still flourishing when the Spaniards arrived, and so there was some actual ethnography where people were recording things. Not so with the Mayans. There is some ethnography. The Mayans still existed when the Spaniards showed up and Europeans showed up to the New World. They still kept books, and they still kept the holidays and the festival calendars, and still worshipped the same gods. But nothing like the urban centers or pyramids or temples were maintained. They were much smaller villages. So the Mayan languages are preserved, and a lot of the Mayan culture was preserved, but most of what we know from the Maya, we know from archaeology. So this is the time period we're talking about here. El Mirador is one of those sites at the beginning. Chichen Itza is right near at the tail end. So because this is something we understand mostly through archaeology, we have to kind of go through how we understand the history of the Maya. And the Maya, because they had such beautiful monuments, and because they were more or less overlooked by the conquistadors, because the conquistadors were interested in sites and people you could conquer and extort for gold and wealth, and these sites were essentially already ruined, there wasn't much in the way of exploration in the 15th, 16th, the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. It's not until the 19th century that people start going into these sites. Many people knew about them. Certainly the Maya knew about them. The Yucatec Maya knew about a lot of these locations, so did the Quiche Maya. And they led Europeans to investigate, and of course the Europeans fell in love with it, because how could you not? It has all of this beautiful sculpture. It's gorgeous. One of the first ones to go were Stephens and Catherwood. Stephens was a writer. Catherwood was a artist, and he made this beautiful set of lithographs based on their expeditions there. And so they wrote a couple of different books. They went several different times and wrote a couple of different books. Now, Catherwood was famous for making the monuments look a little bit more pristine, a little bigger than perhaps they really are in real life. But that actually was very successful in getting people interested. And so it's in the 19th century and very early that we start seeing these kind of views leak out. These are all from Stephens and Catherwood's book. And so these are some of the first views of the Castillo in the Temple of Kukulkan, in Chichen Itza, the first views of Tulum. So here we have a very difficult subject to get into. This captivated the imagination of the European world, and their immediate reaction to it was, you guessed it, this is too sophisticated for Native Americans to have made. What a coinkydink! Europeans, you're so predictable. Anyhow, so immediately they started seeing these structures, these tiered pyramids, these large stone sculptures, and to them, they were very evocative of the kind of things they were seeing in Southeast Asia. In fact, there are terraced pyramids in Indonesia and in Bali and etc., and people are still comparing these things together. This is an example. Okay, there's no aliens, there's no ancient civilizations that connected these two. This is purely convergent, anthropology. What we mean by that is, if you have a system of temples, pyramids, and platforms are some of the simplest structures to build, and if you believe in kind of a tiered society, it makes sense that you make tiered platforms or temples to, mix these things together. And so some of the early conceptions or misconceptions were that the Maya were the descendants of Hindus or people from Indonesia or the what was called the East Indies at the time. And you still get this stuff on things like Ancient Origins and the History Channel and a whole bunch of other places. Joe Rogan, oh gosh, I love Joe Rogan, but Joe Rogan is just a little too credulous. Anybody who, whether it's Graham Hancock or anybody who believes in this stuff, he lets go on his show and talk, and he really ought to be a little less credulous about this stuff. And the reason I'm talking about this is because it's very significant. It does do damage to the study of Mayan culture. These are real people with real accomplishments, and all the evidence is that the Mayan who are living there today are in fact the descendants of the people who built them. And so to hand credit of their accomplishments off to another people across the world because Europeans were uncomfortable with giving the credit to Native Americans, it's just racist, and it really needs to end. This really impacted things. Of course, people were captivated by the glyphs, but the glyphs are often distorted, often stylistically distorted by the artist, but they were also eroded or, fragmentary. And so when people started seeing these things, they started interpreting them in ways that fit with that preconception that these things were coming from, Southeast Asia. So when they saw these kind of like long noses on glyphs, they interpreted these, of course, to be elephants. And so you'll see elephants in some of these early inscriptions. This is actually a mandible of a beetle, but they have interpreted it as an elephant in this regard. Waldeck was infamous for doing this. And so a lot of the early literature that was produced on the... Oh, here's another one. Here's a bearded, kind of European-looking figure. You got to shoehorn that in there somehow. So a lot of the early scholarship was very, very poor and very bad. Of course, no one knew how to read Mayan. The knowledge of how to read Mayan was lost in the 16th century. There were a few Mayan individuals who knew how to read it, but those books were collected and largely destroyed by Catholic missionaries and others, so that was lost. The first serious kind of investigation of the Maya as a people would have to wait till J. Eric S. Thompson. Thompson was pretty much the founder of modern Mayan studies, and he went looking at these cultures and published The Rise and Fall of Mayan Civilization. He's the first to recognize that these were ceremonial centers. These are not urban centers with large populations, rather they're sacred centers where you have a few elites living, and most of the people are living in the hinterland in villages, and they're coming together for ceremonies or marketplaces or other big events. And he was the one that recognized that all of these things seemed to go down at about the same time, indicating that there was some kind of collapse, and he established the narrative of the Mayan collapse. What's funny is a lot of people were trying to give pushback on the collapse at the time, that I said, oh, it's a little too simplistic, and now the evidence has grown that nope, there was a collapse. Something happened to the Maya, something terrible, and we don't know exactly what still. There's lots of theories. And so he was the one that established that. But he's also the one that established this kind of view of the Maya as philosopher kings, as priest kings and astronomers or astrologers who watched the heavens. Now, that's not entirely wrong. Astrology and measuring of the heavens was a fascination of the Maya. We only have 4 Mayan books that survive, and all of them are essentially calendar systems, astrological books for divining the signs in the heavens. So they really did care about astrology. And we do know that the kings and the priestly class were very closely linked, that the king was in many ways the chief priest of his people. But he imagined them as these peaceful kind of astronomer, philosopher kings, and that they had this very peaceful society. And this was something that he kept, pushing many, many decades after it became increasingly obvious that this couldn't be the case. It's easy to kind of interpret them as philosopher kings when you see these beautiful courtly images, such as this relief from Yaxchilan, where you see the Ahau, the ruler, seated there, and he has, in front of him what appears to be an attendant. There are scrolls and scribes working on books. You can see them here. Scribes are always very, very prominent. And so, yeah, I could understand how you could interpret this, but in reality what's happening here is the presentation of captives. The scribes are recording what's that the captives are being handed over. And there were other images at the time that were known. This one was first known in 1946, so, a decade before he published his major book. And in this book you see violence, you see ritualized violence, war. Some of the most vivid examples of war, of human sacrifice, and of human subjugation come from Mayan art. So there is a little bit of willful blindness going on here to the art and iconography to some degree. Attitudes continued to change throughout the second half of the 20th century, and people began to realize that imagining these as kind of peaceful astronomer kings really didn't line up with the art that we were seeing. And so you have scholars like Linda Sheila, who is looking at the artwork and is documenting it and documenting the themes of hierarchy, power, subjugation, elites, all of those things, this cultural hegemony, this strong cultural and militaristic hegemony. She was very responsible for documenting. And then you have a whole bunch of new scholars who come along, including David Stewart, Stephen Houston, and of course now Michael Coe. And the other thing that changes is that we start to be able to read the inscriptions. Most of these inscriptions were untranslatable in the middle of the 20th century. You have a breakthrough happening in the middle of the 20th century, and that breakthrough leads gradually to the translation and the interpretation of the many glyphs and signs. And the Maya do have a full and complete writing system, and they were very concerned about recording particularly battles, dates of coronation and ascension to power, subjugation of enemies, all of those things. And so with those, we can reconstruct, to a limited degree, Mayan history, and they do now have a voice. Part of the other thing that contributed to this was the discovery of literature that had long been lost. Most importantly, the Popova, which was a book of Quiche Maya creation myths that was in a library and was recorded down in the 18th century and wasn't discovered or rediscovered until much later. And it eventually became verified as, an accurate creation myth because it aligned with the iconography and with the epigraphic evidence that we have. So we have a much better understanding of the Maya today. So where do the Maya come from? The answer to that question is we don't know. They're a very, very rapid development, let me put it that way, that right from the earliest periods and the Preclassic periods, we can see the development of writing, but it doesn't take very long before, boom, full-fledged writing is there, full-fledged iconography. The murals at San Bartolo, I think, were particularly revelatory in that it shows a completely developed belief system with maize gods and all the gods that we're used to seeing. And so when you have a culture that just suddenly pulls itself up by its own bootstraps like that, there's a lot of debate about what is going on. Now, there's basically two ways to think of it. One, they're native. They are the Quiche or the Yucatec that are there, and they started in the lowlands of Guatemala, and they just pulled themselves up from their bootstraps and created this civilization. Why not? Lots of other cultures have done it. They could have done it too. The speed and development of the culture is one of the reasons why maybe that's not accurate. And so the other option is that they're immigrants, that they are not locals, and that they immigrated into the region. This area is not terribly far away from the Veracruz coast, and in the Veracruz coast we have the Olmec. And the Olmec, of course, show evidence of ball courts, pyramids, jaguar masks, rain and maize deities, calendars and number systems that are picked up by the Maya. Most significant would be things like the long count, this method of keeping long-term dates we'll talk about in a little bit. And plus there's some similarities. So when we look at something like, say, the Los Limas figure, this Olmec figure holding one of these strange were-jaguar babies, and we can compare it to the kind of organic and beautiful naturalistic form of, say, Yaxchilan steles, or lintels in this case, they look analogous, that we do not see the styles of the Olmec in Teotihuacan and the Mexican basin, but the styles of the Olmec seem very analogous or close to the styles of the Maya. So maybe the Olmec collapsed and maybe they immigrated slowly into the Mayan region and Mayan zone. Maybe they all came at once, and so there was a large group that came in and conquered or established it. Maybe it wasn't terribly densely populated at the time. We don't know. The other possibility is that you just have import of culture, not necessarily import of peoples. Maybe you have a few elites or traders or refugees coming out of the Olmec region, finding their way into this territory, and then once they find into this territory says, wow, we love this culture that you bring, and they assimilated that culture to their own, and they flourished that way. Any of those are possible. There's some fascinating genetic studies happening, and basically we can say for certainty that the people who are living there today are in fact genetically the same as the people who were living there in the Mayan time frame. But before that, it gets a little bit iffier. So maybe there's some interesting genetic studies that are trying to, compare Olmecs to Maya. The one thing we can say for certain is that the Maya revered the Olmec. Michelle Rich, who was a friend of mine and a teacher of mine, actually, she was doing an excavation down in right on the Guatemala-Mexican border. And she was uncovering a tomb, and in that tomb she found a greenstone figure. But stylistically and in terms of material, you could tell this was not a Mayan figure, this was an Olmec figure. So think about that, if you will. You have an Olmec figure that's probably separated by 1,000 years and several hundred miles from this Mayan site, and yet it finds its way into a Mayan tomb. That strongly suggests that Maya were going to Olmec sites, and that they revered these objects. These objects were heirlooms passed down and eventually wind entombed. So what does that mean? Again, is that evidence of appropriation of culture? Or is that evidence of immigration? Or who knows? Let's talk a little about Mayan politics. As I mentioned, there are no true cities in the Mayan sphere. Not like Teotihuacan, where you have these vast cities, neighborhoods, a gridded out, network of streets, and lots of people living in a dense urban environment. No, what you have are kind of urban sacred centers. These were the markets were, these were the rulers were, and these were the elites were, the priests, etc. But most of the people are out living in villages, spread out through the hinterland and the periphery, and they are surrounded by just miles and miles of fields. The Mayan era would have looked vastly different than the rainforest today. There were still rainforests, they still existed, they liked to hunt game, and you need rainforests, and they did manage the rainforests for wood and other resources. But you needed to clear vast territories for corn, and so large areas would have been opened up and cleared, and then these would have just been fields and fields of corn and crops of many kinds. Each urban center, then, is a kind of self-contained city-state, where you have a ruler and his warriors, his elite, and priests and scribes and artists, who are all part of this noble elite caste, and they're at the top. And the leader is the Aha, the Lord. There's the glyph for the Lord, and he is a dynastic king, a very powerful, complete dynastic king. There is some tension between priests and kings, but not to the degree that you see in Road to El Dorado. Generally, the king is in charge. He is the guy in charge, and he is the main functionary for religious items as well. Sometimes these city-states would join together into kind of loose religious and ethnic confederations, but oftentimes they were at each other's throats. One of the things that's so interesting about so many of the inscriptions and the epigraphic evidence that we find is the constant mention of war, the constant mention of the subjugation of other peoples. Here in the Bonampak mural, you can see how they are bleeding from their fingers. They've cut their own thumbs and fingers to bleed, to offer to this lord, who looks absolutely resplendent with this jade, mask on his chest, his incredible headdress of quetzal feathers, and his just absolutely spanking jaguar doublet. Why can't I dress like that? Anyhow, so he's obviously this elite, and they are doing everything in their power to say, please don't kill us. They are offering freely the blood of their hands. So there's this intense competition for trade, for resources, but the number one thing is prisoners of war. These city-states were at constant war with each other, and all of the imagery reflects that. This is a lintel from Calakmul, and in this, this is Kawil, who was one of the rulers of Calakmul, and he records his victory as he runs this spear through someone, and it says, "Blood was pooled, and the skulls of the people of the central place of Tikal were piled up." Is that not the most metal thing you've ever heard in your life? Yikes. These people did not shy away from conflict. And while some of this is the usual things we fight wars over, resource, pride, land, the primary thing that they fought over was for prisoners of war for sacrifice, to honor their gods and their ancestors. Ritualized warfare was a major feature of their civilization. And so, not surprisingly, I'm sorry, I misspoke. This is the Bonampak lintel, but I'm reading an inscription from Calakmul. This is not the same inscription. But I'm reading an inscription to give you the kind of flavor text of what we're talking about. Didn't want to confuse that. But when we look at these, again, all of it is the visual culture of subjugation, of one party forcing another party to kind of be submissive politically. Now, I don't expect you to actually get a sense of this thing by looking at it right here. But this is this wonderful diagram showing all of the different epigraphic evidence that we have. Epigraphic evidence, by the way, are just inscriptions. So epigraphic evidence is inscriptions of monuments. And so this is all of the epigraphic statements that we have. So every time somebody said, "Yeah, I kicked butt and took names, and that town over there is my biatch." That's a little... I shouldn't have said that. Okay. Mom's listening. I'm not going to edit it out. We're going to own it. Okay. Apologies to anyone who's offended. But I made that person my prison girlfriend, let us say. That's recorded, and it's put down in the monuments. And so you can see the connections. Some of these are, every time you see a red one, that's a conflict. Some are, family, dynastic ties, intermarriages, etc. And it's just dizzyingly complex. So the question here is, how did this work? And this just felt so counterintuitive to me at first, when I first started studying the Maya. How is it that you can have so many different cities in constant war and conflict over centuries and have such an incredible artistic and a production and such a consistent building of monuments? And then it struck me. I've heard this story before. If you go to the Renaissance, if you go to Italy, Italy is not a unified country in the 15th and 16th century. No, it's a country of rival city-states. Padua, Pisa, Genoa, Florence, Siena, all of these cities, Venice, all of these cities absolutely hate each other. They absolutely despise each other, and they fought bitter wars with each other constantly, and they were intense competition with trade. And yet it's this intense competitive environment that causes them to build churches. I mean, the whole reason Il Duomo in the cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, gets built is they want to basically build a bigger church than Siena. They hear Siena is building this big church. They're like, "Oh, no, you don't. We're going to build a bigger church than you." Then, of course, they build it so big they don't know how to put a dome over it, and they have to get Brunelleschi to come around 80 years later and finish it. So every one of these pyramids, every one of these monuments, these dynastic monuments are the same. They are all about demonstrating the demonstration of power. And so perhaps this competition isn't so bizarre. So let's talk about Mayan religion. Mayan religion is something that we could only guess at until we started to get two things. One was we started to be able to translate these inscriptions. And the second is we got the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh, of course, is this text that was lost and then recovered in a manuscript. So it literally means the book of the people, and it's written by the Quiché Maya. And it was probably written down sometime in the 18th century, probably by Francisco Jimenez. And he translated it into Quiché, and then he wrote it down. He transliterated it using modern Roman alphabet transliterated the Quiché, and then he also wrote the Spanish. So we have this kind of dual thing. And then it ended up wounding just being filed away in some library until somebody stumbled upon this and said, could this possibly be real? And yes, it does. It does, in fact, seem to be real. Now, some qualifications are in order. This thing was written probably a century or two after the conquest, which means that it might be subject to later kind of modification. It's also the myth only of the Quiche Maya. The Quiche Maya are the Maya that lived down in what is modern-day Guatemala, particularly in the highlands of Guatemala. And they speak an entirely different dialect than the Yucatec Maya, which are in the Yucatan. And so therefore, we might see some variances between various different cities about their beliefs. So in the same way that we kind of take Aztec cosmology and try to project it backward onto the Toltecs, or take Andean cosmology from the Quechua, the Inca, and project it back onto things like Tiwanaku, we're doing the same thing. But what else are you going to do? You pretty much have to figure this out some way, and this is the best way that we can. And when we look at these beautiful cylindrical vessels, such as the one you're seeing here, these are cylindrical vessels that were very common in the classic period, and they have these beautiful figures on them. And they're very, very closely related to book production and writing, because they're probably being made by the very same scribes. The iconography does seem to align with what we're reading in the Popol Vuh, so that's probably a good sense that we can trust it. You'll see a lot of these cylindrical vessels, but we'll often, photograph them in a way so that we unroll them so it's a little easier to see the scene. And the story of the Popol Vuh tells the story of the creation myth, but it's principally focused on the hero twins. And the hero twins are Hunter and Jaguar Deer, or Hanapu and Shabalunke, and their conflicts with the lords of Xibalba. So it begins with an account of creation, and here we need to talk about the Seba Tree. At the center of Mayan creation is the Seba Tree. The Seba Tree is this tree that joins the underworld with the mortal realm, and then also with the heavens above. And as you can see, it is oriented in 4 classic directions. The Seba Tree is often described as a specific, the world tree is described as a specific tree. It's a tree native to the region, very big tree. And as you can see in this stele, it is personified as a caiman, with its back, extending up into the branches of the tree. And that's because the tree itself is spiked, like the back of a caiman crocodile. So this story starts with a group of gods who come together to make the creation. And there's a long list of titles. And there's some debate about, are the titles multiple titles of the same gods, or are they different gods? And the general feeling is that they're mostly titles of the same 3 gods. And the 2 principal gods are going to be Shakumene and Shapiakok. And those are alternately grandmother and grandfather, which are called, framer and shaper, oftentimes. And then the other one is going to be the Quetzal serpent, the plumed serpent, who seems to be a kind of chief director of the creation. And so you have grandfather and grandmother come together. I'm going to read the opening to you. Framer and shaper, she who has borne children, and he who has engendered sons. Hanapu possum and Hanapu coyote, great white peccary and pizote, sovereign and Quetzal serpent, heart of the lake and heart of the sea, creator of the blue-green plate would be the earth, and creator of the blue-green bowl. The blue-green bowl is the bowl of the heavens, the sky. Midwife and patriarch, Shipeakok and Shamukane, embracer and shelterer, twice midwife and twice patriarch. So they come together with Quetzal serpent, plumed serpent, and they begin the work of creation. And the interesting thing about the Mayan creation myth is how it all goes wrong. Everything goes wrong. They create the world, and the purpose of creating the world is to create beings in the world who can honor and sustain the gods. And everything goes wrong. So they first create the heavens and the earth and everything in it, and they speak the words, and creation is made. And in that creation, they create first the plants, but the world is silent, and so they give the world creatures that can make noise, and those creatures are deer and birds, specifically mentioned deer and birds. And the deer and birds are created to be devotees, to be worshippers of the gods. But the deer and the birds can only make chattering noises. They cannot speak. And so for this, they're not deemed worthy to be the worshippers of the gods. So they demote them to be just animals, to be food and meat for later creations. And they start up 2 other iterations of creations. The first time, they try to make men out of mud. But the men of mud have no will. They melt back down into the earth. They cannot speak. And so therefore, they are considered not worthy. And so the creation goes wrong a second time. And then they have the third creation. They make people out of wood. They make the men out of wood and the women out of reeds. And they bind them together. Now, these people are intelligent and can do things. They can move, and they can walk, and they can create. But they have no blood. They have no life in them. And so they're like automatons and robots. And because of this, they don't learn respect for the gods, and they have no respect for the gods. And so the gods, particularly, Framer, Shaper, Quetzal Serpent, decide we have to destroy them and wipe them out. And so they wipe them out. They send other gods and other minions, things like Face Gouger and Face Chiseler and Eye Gouger, all these great gods they send, and they destroy them, and they break them down, and they wipe them out in a flood of tree resin. It's kind of interesting. And a few of them survive, and those become spider monkeys, which is the origin of why spider monkeys are so much like men, but not men. And so the creation really goes astray. And so then we get into the story of how creation ultimately comes about. And this is where the beginning of the hero twins are told. And the story, as it's written, takes a kind of an abrupt turn. It has a flash forward. There are 2 sets of twins. There's 1 hunter and 7 hunter, which are the father and the uncle of the next set of hero twins, which are Hanapu and Shabalanque, hunter and jaguar deer, or spotted deer. And so what's interesting is, for a couple of episodes here, we actually go to the second set of hero twins, Hanapu and Shabalanque. And they don't tell the story of how they come to be or how they're born or anything. We just hear some of their exploits. And right away we can tell these are the gods that are going to bring order to the universe. So there's this episode told about 7 Macaw, Vukub Kish. Vukub Kakish is this strange bird-like demon that rests in the sky. And this is before the sun and the moon reveal their face. And so many people associate this with the Big Dipper, because it has 7 stars. And so this 7 Macaw sets itself in the sky and pretends to be the sun. And I mean by the sun, I mean S-U-N, the sun in the sky. But it's a false sun. And so we have these scenes where the hero twins come along and use a blowgun to shoot it out of the sky. And so what they're saying is that no, you're reaching above your station. There's also a whole series of events where the son of 7 Macaw has 400 sons, and the hero twins defeat them all. And by defeating them, they create the astronomical features of the sky and the features of the natural world. And so we kind of have this interlude telling of the great exploits of these 2 hero twins before finally going back and saying, oh yeah, how did we get to the hero twins in the first place? Okay, well, Shibayakok and Shamunakane, the grandfather and grandmother, they have 2 sons, and those sons are 1 hunter and 7 hunter, Han Hanapu and Vukub Hanapu. And they are a great set of heroes. And then Shibayakok kind of disappears from the story. We're not entirely certain why. And then we only really ever hear of Shimunakane after this, and she is the grandmother. And so she is the grandmother of the second set of hero twins, but the mother of Hun Hanapu and Vukub Hanapu, 1 and 7 Hunter. And 1 and 7 Hunter, they have a whole series of exploits. And the thing that they're noted for is that they are very good at playing ball. That they play the ball game, and in doing so, they play the ball game. You get the attention of these guys, who are the lords of Xibalba. Now, Xibalba is the underworld. They hear the noise that 1 and 7 Hunter are making, and they say, what is this noise? And these lords have really some great names. The two principal villains of the story are 1 Death and 7 Death, 1 and 7 being very significant numbers. But there's also things like there's Lord Pus Demon and Jaundice Demon and Blood Drinker, and a few other kind of scary names. I can't remember them all. They're really fantastic. And these are the lords of the underworld, and they have power over life and death. And so they call Hun Hanapu and Vukub Hanapu, 1 Hunter and 7 Hunter, to come down. And they say, hey, if you come down, we will give you this really spectacular set of ball equipment for playing a ball game. And if you come down and compete against us. And so they go down into Xibalba, they go down into the underworld, and Xibalba is a crazy place. This is described as a series of houses or pavilions that you go through, and one is a pavilion of darkness, one is a pavilion of frost, one is a house of jaguars, where there's nothing but jaguars who gnash at you, one is a house of bats, and the last one is like a house of blades. It's really an awful place. They are brought down, but the lords of Xibalba don't play nice. They're not nice gods. They're really nasty gods, and they're terrible cheats. And they put the 1 Hunter and 7 Hunter to all these tests. They have to, smoke cigars, and light torches, but the torches can't be consumed in the day by the morning, which of course is impossible. They make them sit down on this bench, which is too hot, so it burns their bottoms. All kinds of terrible things. And so, of course, 1 Hunter and 7 Hunter lose this game, and by losing this game, they lose their life. And they burn the body of 7 Hunter, but they take the head of 1 Hunter and they hang it in a tree. And this is a calabash tree. And a calabash tree is a tree that's known for giving gourds that often are bleached white, and they're about the size of a skull. So this is very evocative imagery. And the calabash gourd is used as a vessel for, holding liquids, even today. So the head is there, and this tree bears strange fruit. And the calabash gourd, and it had never ever bloomed before or produced fruit. And it produces this skull-like fruit that is the head of Hun Hanapu. And it is somehow conscious and can speak. A daughter of the lords of Xibalba by the name of Shakik. Shakik hears about this and says, I must see this. And so she goes to see it. And she sees the head, and she has this conversation with the head. And Hun Hanapu offers to give her a kind of a gift. And he says basically that, that I'm dead and I have no life in me, but the life of a man is his children. And so he says, put out your hand, and she puts out her hand, and he spits into her hand. So the decapitated head spits into her hand, and the saliva immediately disappears, but she becomes miraculously impregnated. Well, her father, who is a lord of Xibalba, finds out and is immediately upset. You have committed fornication. Who's the father? And she says, I haven't committed fornication. And she tells the story, and of course they wish to destroy her. And so we see this snake loop lady, and we often think this is Shakik. She's often paired up against these kind of awful, lecherous old gods. You can see emerging out of this kind of serpent's mouth like a spirit. So here is she, this very voluptuous goddess, enclosed in the serpent there. And she goes down. She eventually escapes and finds her way to the surface world, and she has no choice but to seek out her mother-in-law, Shimunakane. And Shimunakane really doesn't like her and denies that she's her mother-in-law. And there's also a couple of other kids there that are children from one hunter from a previous marriage, as it were. And so she to prove that she is in fact grandmother's daughter-in-law, she is given a task to go collect maize, corn. But the stalk of corn, there's only one stalk of corn and there's only a couple of ears on it, and she can't possibly collect enough maize. So she calls out to the day bearers. This is to, again, astronomical phenomenon, goddesses that move the stars around the sky. And they come and magically assist her and bring all the corn together. And of course, grandmother sees this and recognizes, well, you must be my daughter-in-law. And so she gets accepted into the household and she gives birth to 2 twins. And she names these twins after their father, and the other one is named Xbalanque. So the first one's named Hunahpu, or Hunter, after her father. So these are the son and the nephew, by magical means, by miraculous means, of the first Hunahpu. And their names are Hunahpu and Jaguar Deer, or Spotted Deer. And so they then go on and have a series of adventures. These are the 2 twins that are the hero twins. These are the hero twins that defeat Seven Macaw and all of his sons, and create the stars in the sky and all of the other things. And we find out how they get their powers. They're interesting because they themselves are partially descended from the gods of the underworld through their mother on their mother's side, but they're also descended from Framer and Shaper on their father's side. So they have this innate power to overcome many different things. Well, all of their exploits and all of their achievements catch the attentions of the lords of Xibalba, and so they are called down to the lords of Xibalba, and we believe that's what this scene is it shows them being presented in front of the lords of Xibalba. And they have to go through an incredible series of trials. They have to go through the House of Darkness, the House of Frost, the House of Jaguars, the House of Bats, and the House of Blades. And they come through it all, despite all of the tortures and all the terrible cheating of the lords of Xibalba, to come and play this ball game. But the 2, because they have this inheritance from the lords of Xibalba, have power over life and death. And they play this ball game, and at one point, Hunahpu's head is decapitated, and they replace his head with a fake head, and his head becomes the ball in the ball game. Then they restore his head. But eventually the lords of Xibalba cheat so bad that they win the game, and they demand that Hunahpu and Xbalanque are sacrificed, and they are sacrificed. But because they are like magicians and have this power of death, they resurrect themselves. And this is astonishing to all. And they perform this dance that allows them to kill themselves and resurrect themselves many times. And they flee Xibalba, they prove their mettle everywhere else, and they prove that they have this power over life and death. And eventually, they pull a trick on the lords of Xibalba. The lords of Xibalba say, do you have this power to do this over everyone? And they say, sure. And so they kill somebody, bring them back to life, and eventually the lords of Xibalba are like, oh, do me. Hey, kill me and bring me back to life. But of course, that's just a trick. And of course, the lords of Xibalba are slain. And by this, Hunahpu and Xbalanque prove that they are the masters of the universe, and they put the lords of Xibalba in their place and kill them and seal them away forever as the lords of the death. And they take their rightful place, and they order the universe around them in this ball game. And this is probably the best evidence for what's the meaning of the ball game and what in fact is the meaning of Hunahpu and Xbalanque, because they then, after they order the universe and slay all these pretenders to being the rulers of the universe, they become the sun and the moon. So Hunahpu becomes the sun and Xbalanque becomes the moon. So you look at the moon at night, you see the spots on it. It's like a spotted deer. That's why it's jaguar deer or spotted deer, Xbalanque. And so these are the 2 creator gods. And these 2 creator gods then can finally set the universe in order. There is a sun, there is a moon. They start time time doesn't really exist until they create the sun and the moon and the markers of time. It's really interesting cosmological view. And then with Framer and Shaper and Quetzal Serpent, they can truly create men that are worthy of worshiping the gods. And the way they create men is they take corn, maize, they take cornmeal, masa, and they mix it with blood. And blood is, and it's their blood. And this is what makes men that have life and can think and can speak and have reason and can create art and can worship the gods. And it also kind of explains the Mayan cosmology, because the Mayan cosmology and the Mesoamerican cosmology is really a universe that's on the edge of a knife. It can tip into chaos very easily, and it has to be maintained by men, because men were made to maintain it. And how do they maintain it? They maintain it through sacrifice. They maintain it through blood. The very gods who framed the universe gave of their own blood and life to create and give us the sun and the moon and order, and so therefore, how can we do less? So sacrifice and bloodletting are going to be major features of Mayan religion in virtually everything that we see and do. In this case, we have Shield Jaguar, who is the Aha, the king, and Lady Shok, and he is bearing a torch because they are about to make an act of sacrifice. And when you look at her, you'll notice that she has a bowl, and the bowl is full of paper, and the paper has Mayan glyphs on it. And in this case, the Mayan glyphs are, again, probably this invocation, and she is bleeding on this. And how is she doing this? She's doing this by passing a barbed rope through her tongue. No, she is not a piercing enthusiast. This is how you draw blood. So there's all these connections here. The written word is an element of sacrifice. The bark paper, the hoon, the fig bark paper, is about to be burned. The blood coming from nobles in this case. And if you think this is rough, she's actually kind of getting off easy, because we see in other depictions that it was very common that the king, the Aha, would actually have to pierce his phallus, his penis, with a stingray spine. So, yikes. Again, the emblems of life, the emblems of speech, of fertility and reason are the source of life. And this is pretty much something that had to be done daily. Let's hope this particular act didn't have to be done daily, but bloodletting and sacrifice was something that needed to be done daily. And of course, on major holidays, there would be a lot of sacrifice. So here in this lintel, we can see Lady Kabal Shuk and this vision serpent. She, again, has this clay pot, and she is burning paper, and rising from the paper is a serpent. And the serpent's mouth is just this wide maw, it just comes open, and out of it comes an ancestor. So the revitalization of your ancestors, the maintenance of your ancestors, is a very important feature. And also in this imagery, anything that is moving like a serpent, lightning, water, blood, is going to be personified as a serpent. Smoke, stars, all of these kinds of things. And so themes of death and afterlife are common. Caves and temples are seen as, and also things like cenotes, sinkholes and springs, are seen as entrances to Xibalba. These are ways to access Xibalba. And a great effort is made, particularly for elites, to preserve the body. We see them buried with grave goods in sarcophagi, such as this immense sarcophagus lid for Lord Bacall. We see them covered behind jade masks. And we also see ancestral worship. And the themes here are going to be themes of rebirth. We'll talk about more of this one in detail, but this one shows Lord Bacall being consumed by what we call a Wheats monster, an earth monster, and this results in being born into the world tree that emerges from him. We likewise see this revival and this sense of honoring ancestors in dynastic art. So this is altar Q. This is from Copan in Honduras. And here we have 4 sides, and on all 4 sides are 4 different ancestors, and then an inscription and glyphs above. The sacrifices there would then, literally the blood would pour over the top of the ancestors, revitalizing them, giving them life. And so when we see these ancestors, what I love about these ancestors is they are all in their finery with their turbans and their outfits, but they are all seated on cushions, and the cushions take the forms of the glyphs that represent their names. So again, we'll talk about this in a bit, writing and art blend so freely together here. So this monument would have been erected by King Yashpak in 776 AD. And so it goes all the way back to 426 AD. It shows each of his ancestors in turn leading up to his life. And it shows how closely writing and art are linked together, which brings us to Mayan writing and Mayan glyphs. So Mayan glyphs, again, were not really understood. The knowledge of how to write in the glyphs had passed away from all Mayan cultures, and it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that people started kind of compiling this. The 2 individuals that we give credit for the breakthrough on this are Konorosov. Yuri Konorosov was a Russian scholar, and he was the first to really compile these and do a lot of the work of breaking down, where and how many times we see a glyph or a repetition of a glyph, because repetition is the basis of deciphering and decoding anything. The first real breakthrough is going to be Tatiana Proskoryakov. Proskoryakov was the first to recognize that at the beginning of almost every single one of these inscriptions, there was a particular glyph. And she identified this glyph as a marker of date or rule, indicating that this person was a ruler from these time periods to other time periods. And that's what allowed us to break this seemingly endless wall of glyphs into more discrete chunks. Because if you had the date marker that said this ruler or this event began at this time, and you could look at that glyph and say, okay, this is where this passage begins, you could then follow it to the next, date marker, and that gave you a much more easily digestible chunk. And from here, it quickly became clear that we were looking at Mayan. Thankfully, there's lots of Mayan speakers still around, and we started breaking this down. Mayan is an incredibly hard language to learn and to read. For one, it's because Mayan is not written in any one way and doesn't have to be written in every one way. There are several ways to read a Mayan glyph. First of all, a glyph is not actually one glyph. It's actually a compilation of several glyphs. You have a main sign, and then above it you can have a kind of superfix, and then in front of it you can have a kind of prefix. These bundles of glyphs can be thought of as little compact words. These little glyphs create words. Those words are then usually put together in 2 columns, and the columns are read left to right and then top to bottom. So if you saw 2 rows of columns, you can always, if you know where the first is, you just keep going and you read 2 at a time, then go up to the next one and then down and over again. The problem comes in how many different ways you can write a glyph. Let's take a look at this one. These are 2 different ways of writing the word jaguar, Baalam. And there's a couple of different ways to do it. For one, you can just draw a picture of a jaguar head. So right there, ding, no problem. That one is easy to read. So whenever you see that, that's jaguar. And this is what we call an ideogram or a logogram. That means that a single glyph stands in for a single word. And almost all early writing systems stumble upon this. This is what was first done in Sumeria, it was first done in Egypt. It's the way Chinese was written and still is. An ideogram or a logogram, a symbol that stands for a single word, is just a very simple writing system. But after a while, you realize, well, we have a lot of words, and do we really need an ideogram for each word? That gets kind of tedious. Chinese, that's the way it's done, and you have to learn like 2,000 unique symbols to kind of read a Chinese newspaper, a common Chinese newspaper. That's really, really tedious. Most cultures realize, okay, we could use ideograms for the important words, but we'll use syllabic or phonetic symbols, and so that's what they do as well. So this is Balam, but this is also Balam. And this one is made from combining several symbols together. You can see the Ba, which is right there, the La, which is right there, and then the other part up here becomes the next group. So there's two different ways that you can write this. Oh, but wait, there's more. Because you can actually write it several different ways. This one is just the glyph. This one is taking the phonetic symbol combined with the glyph. This one is the phonetic symbol combined with a different phonetic glyph. This is a logogram, combined with a different phonetic glyph. Or you can combine all three. Or you can just use the phonetic symbols. All of these are correct. Oh. So imagine, this is why Mayan was so hard to translate, because Mayan requires you to actually not just know the ideograms, but to know all the phonetic symbols, and also to kind of interpret what the scribe is doing. This makes Mayan one of the most beautiful and complicated writing systems, but it's a writing system for professional scribes and artists, because if you need to alter the glyph in order to spell it a different way and make it a kind of concrete poetry, it depends on what you're trying to emphasize. So you can emphasize the meaning of a glyph by incorporating a phonetic glyph, and that gives you another gloss, another level of connotation in writing this. And we are probably missing an awful lot here. We're probably just reading the most closest surface reading of this. There are probably little subtle puns and allusions in every one of these that we're missing because we don't know how it's done. And it not only differs, it differs from city to city because they have different dialects, but they have different scripts, and it also differs from scribe to scribe. It gives the scribe an enormous amount of freedom, which probably explains why scribes are so prominent. When we see scribes, they are always depicted as elites, as nobles. We see them everywhere. Oh, there's another little episode I forgot, that the hero twins have a little falling out with their half-brothers, and they trick them up into going into trees and turn them into howler monkeys, which then become the gods of scribes. So many adventures for the hero twins. It's so cool. So at any rate, and so we see scribes with brushes working. We see them on these ceremonial vessels. What I love about this is that this scribe is a god of scribes, and notice that his headdress actually has brushes. I love how he has this. I mean, look at this hand and the brush, and he's like sitting here explaining this guy. It's so wonderful. Here's another one of these where, again, you have scribes clearly indicated as high-status individuals with sophisticated instruments. Here again, he has brushes in his headdress. So not just a convenient way to store them, but again, an emblem to show the status of the individual. So it shouldn't surprise you that writing is very, very important in Mayan civilization. And we know that they had extensive writings. We see it on these things. I mean, we see them writing books. That's what this thing is here. This is a book. This is what we call a codex. And it's a stack of fig bark paper. And these stacks would be stitched together into large codices and books. But regrettably, most of these books, and there were probably hundreds if not thousands of these, were destroyed in the 16th and 17th century. There's a very sad tale where in the early history of the Christianization of the Maya, a boy was bringing a image of the Virgin Mary in a procession in an early Christian church. And when he dropped the image, it broke open, and they discovered that inside of it was a idol. I think it was chalk of a Mayan deity, an underworld deity, that they had kind of associated with the Virgin Mary. And of course, the Catholic monks absolutely had a fit. Christianity is absolutely against the syncretism. Syncretism is pretty common in other cultures. You have gods of the sky, we have gods of the sky. Maybe they're the same god, we'll blend them together. But that is not something that's done in Christianity. And so that caused a purge and a burning of a lot of books. And almost all of the books that survived just because they were taken back to Europe as curiosities. And most of these wound up in collections and then lost and were rediscovered in the collections. So the only two complete Mayan books we have are the Dresden Codex and the Madrid Codex. The Paris Codex is fragmentary, but is in pretty good shape. The Gröller Codex is a recent discovery, and it's just 11 pages. So we have this incredible loss of material, and it's just tragic. No doubt histories, natural histories and other things were lost. When we look at these books, the Madrid Codex is probably the least artistic. It has the least amount of color, but it's the most complete book. It's currently divided into two parts, and they have this fan-fold structure. So hun, or a model, whatever you want to call it. Model is the Nahuatl word. Hun is the Mayan word. It's a fig bark paper that's very, very durable, but it's kind of rigid. And it works very well in this fanfold. What I love about the fanfold is it mixes the best of both worlds. It's like a book, so you can hold it together and flip pages like a regular book, what we call a book, or a codex. But you can also spread it out like a scroll so that everybody can kind of look at it at the same time. It's very, very similar to the Dresden Codex, which is probably the most elaborate of these, that has probably the best coloring. It has these very vivid pages and representations of gods. There's some variation between these texts, but in most cases these are divination texts. What we mean by that is that they are calendar systems that chart certain days of the year and then give you kind of ways to read the days of the year. Is this an auspicious day to go to war? Is this an auspicious day to perform this festival, etc.? All of these things are detailed. And so these are ways of reading your fortune. So not surprisingly, you'll see the number system here in front of each one of these. These are lists of dates. They're predominantly calendar books, which brings us to the Mayan calendar. So the Mayan calendar is really this incredibly complicated system. It has two parts, the Hab and the Tzolk'in. The Tzolk'in is a modern Yucatec word. We don't know what the Mayan called it, but it works. It means like the order of the days. And the Hab is the 365-day year calendar. It has 18 months of 20 days. And then you have 5 evil days, the Wayeb. The Wayeb are these nameless, unlucky days that are tacked on at the end of the year. You don't want your kid born on those days because you may have to kill your kid because if he's born on a nameless day. So they are not considered as part of the long count or any of the other things. But they realize that the sun did not return until 365 days, but that doesn't quite work with the perfect numerology of 360. So they added them in. That's pretty straightforward. The Tzolk'in, however, is really complex, and people don't really know how it works unless you kind of explain it. So here is a kind of diagram. The best way to think of this is as a kind of set of nested wheels. There are 20 day names here, and then there are 13 numbers here. And these all interact with the Hab, that is the 365-day year. And so you have a 260-day cycle. If you have 13 numbers, and 20 named days, this will create a cycle of 260 days. Well, 260 is less than 365, so the ritual calendar is constantly moving relative to the solar calendar. And it takes approximately 52 years before the cycle will repeat. So the exact combination of number, Solkine date, and Hob date will not repeat for 52 years. And it's this system by which they decided which feasts to have, when to perform sacrifice, when the great and important moments were. Now, why 26 and 13? Nobody knows. Nobody has any real, not 26, 20 and 13. Why? No one really knows. There's been some speculation that maybe this was an attempt to align a lunar calendar, an earlier lunar calendar with a solar calendar, and then after a while they just ditched having to deal with the lunar calendar and just rounded it off to this, kind of strange number. I don't know that really works. The antiquity of this system is very well attested in the archaeology, and it suggests that it's very, very old. So we really can't say for certain, but this is really the important numbering of their days. And so all significant days will have both a Hob date and a Solkine date, and those will be very unique. Now that actually gets really complicated, and it's kind of hard to give firm dates. And so the Maya actually invented another calendar system called the long count. The long count takes that 360-day cycle. It kind of ignores the unlucky, nameless days at the end, the Wayab. And it just repeats this 360-day cycle endlessly. And this gives you a hard count for every single event in the Mayan calendar, and it's really quite incredible. So you have a kin, which is 1 day, a winal, which is 20 kins, or 20 days, a tun, which is 18 winal, that gets you to 360 days, that's close to a year. But then you have the katun, which is 20 tun, and then you have the baktun, which is 20 katun. The long count had a cycle of 13 baktun, and that was believed to be the creation cycle of the world. And so that places the start of this date at, let me see, I've got it here, August 11th, 3114 BCE in the Gregorian calendar. That's just insane. No one really knows why we have this really ancient date, why the long count starts so far back into the past. And no one really knows why it goes so far into the future. It's really kind of unusual. What's fascinating is that we know the end of the Baktun as well. It ended well past the end of the Mayan period. It ended, in fact, on December 21st, 2012. And Michael Coe was the first person to, when he read this inscription, interpreted this to mean that this is when the Maya thought the end of the world was going to happen. He since has regretted that interpretation, and he now, and all scholars believe that, no, this doesn't mean the end of the world. The Maya didn't believe in a world that had a definitive ending and a definitive beginning and an eschatology like Christians do. Instead, they believed that the world was an endless series of cycles of death and rebirth. And so at the end of the Baktun, there was not going to be some horrible calamity that inspired a lot of really terrible movies and memes that confused the Aztec calendar with the Mayan calendar. I got so sick of seeing those in 2012. But instead, it would just be the rebirth of another movement, and it would just start the cycle all over again. So this incredibly deep sense of time is very, very useful, because it was universal across the Mayan sphere, which means that generally for very important dates, they would not just give the Hob or the reign of the ruler, they would actually give the long count, which means that if we see a long count date in Calakmul, we can correspond it to other dates in Piedras Negros or Tikal or everywhere we happen to see it, and that means we can have a greater sense of dates. And some of these dates we know with incredible precision. It's really amazing. The last major cultural feature I want to talk about with the Maya is going to be the Mesoamerican ball game. The ball game, as we saw demonstrated in the hero myth, the hero twins myth, is the essential sport and ritual activity of the Maya. It was incredibly popular. Some sites don't have ball courts. That doesn't mean that they didn't play the ball game. They could have played it in an open field. Some sites in, like, especially the Mexican basin, like Teotihuacan, don't have ball courts. But almost every site in the Mesoamerican sphere, not just the Mayan sphere, has a ball court. Every place has, a ball court. Some have 24, which is just remarkable mania for it. And if you get into the imagery of it, especially this bizarre story of Hunahpu exchanging his head for the ball and then restoring his head, and Hunahpu representing the sun, the mythology of it kind of makes sense. The ball game is a kind of ritual reenactment of the movement of the sun, and it was played in a very particular way. For one, the ball was a solid ball of rubber. So those dodgeballs that you got hit with in grade school, those things are inflatable and they're hollow. Imagine how bad, you remember how bad those hurt? Yeah. So imagine a ball about that size full of solid rubber. Yeah, it would take your skull off. And so if you're playing this game, you need lots of equipment. So when we see these guys, they have endless amounts of fabric and material and headdresses and helmets wrapped around them. The ball is often shown very large, but in a few of these inscriptions, there's indications of giving the diameter of the ball. So the ball probably would have been around somewhere to 8 to 10 inches in diameter. And it was a game played by elites and all kinds of warriors. Here you see a depiction of a king, playing. And the way you played this game, the rule was you couldn't touch the ball with your hands or feet, so you had to hit it with your hip. And you would slide in and crack it with your hip and bounce it away. And so that's why we have these incredibly dynamic figures leaning in to crack the ball and smack the ball away. That ball is a little bit bigger than the ball would have been. This is probably a little bit more accurate depiction of the size of the ball. We also have these beautiful figures that show this incredible layering of the ball equipment and this getting down on one knee to thrust your hip. Crap, I can't get out of bed in the morning without cracking half my joints. I can't imagine throwing myself down on my knees or my backside to crack it with my hip. And with a solid rubber ball, you can imagine that would have hurt like crazy. So you can't go into this unprepared. And so you see these layers of cloth. Underneath that cloth, there would have been a yoke, probably carved out of wood. And we know that because we actually have some of these yokes. The yokes, in these cases, are ceremonial yokes. These are carved from greenstone and jade. Nobody's wearing a stone yoke. I don't want to give you that impression. That would just be murder, carrying this thing around the middle. The originals were carved out of wood. The stone ones are ceremonial, ceremonial objects and votives to put in tombs and other votive deposits. But it gives us a sense of what this means. Remember that the original hero twins fought the Lords of Xibalba, so this is a fight with death and with the Lords of Xibalba to keep the sun in motion and to keep the ordered universe going. This yoke is in the shape of a frog. So you have his back leg here and his front leg. Here's his eyes. Frogs, of course, go into water. Water is a kind of boundary between this world and the underworld, so it makes sense. You also see dwarves. Dwarves, for some reason, in Mesoamerican iconography, are representations of liminal figures that can cross over into the underworld. We also see representations of what might be the hero twins themselves. And there are endless numbers of these with representations of gods, frogs, and also, obviously, representations of death. If you're in this battle against the forces of death, those would be represented. The ball game is typically played on an eye-shaped court. It has, kind of an end zone on either side, although they're not really end zones or goals. They just seem to be open areas on either end, and a long, narrow playing field in between. You can see this everywhere. This is Monte Alban, which is one of the earliest ball courts. Copan has a ball court. When you are in this ball court, you have a playing alley, and that's where the action happens. And then there's this kind of apron wall, which is angled. These aren't bleacher seats. These are actually playing surfaces. People would actually stand on the top of these walls to watch the game, and these angled surfaces would be the surfaces that you would play off of. So here are these surfaces that you could play off of. Now, not in every ball court, but in most ball courts, there's one other feature, and that's a hoop. A stone hoop is set on edge and set into the apron wall. Some of these hoops are large and pretty low, and some of them are pretty dang high. And every one of these ball courts is different. The ones at, Uxmal and Copan are relatively small, but the one at Chichen Itza are just enormous. No one's really quite certain why they're so different. You have these large sloping sides that you bounce the ball off of. There are some leagues that have recreated this sport that you can go watch. And no one is exactly certain on the rules. Teams could be as small as, 5 on a side, or they could be as big as 40. Two teams seem to be playing at the same time, but we don't know if they're necessarily playing against each other or playing against the ball, against themselves, and one side is performing against the other. It's been recreated both ways. If you've seen the game in Road to El Dorado, it's very spirited, but most of that is fantasy. But doing it with the hip is the way it's done. I have no knowledge of the usefulness of armadillos in the ball game. But if you go and look up some of these people recreating it, they really can, just using the hip, get the ball to go through the hoop. Now, you notice these guys aren't outfitted to the extremes that they were, but the ball they're playing with is a much, much softer ball, and it's not a solid rubber ball. That would just be suicide. I have to assume that the court at Chichen Itza is the major leagues, because it's just gigantic. It's a massive court, and the hoop is way the heck up there. This wall is like 30 feet tall, and you can't even imagine. You can't even imagine, kind of running up on the short apron wall and booting it with your hip and getting it to go through there, but they apparently did. Here is the hoop. Now, as to what this is all about, again, one of the reliefs from Chichen Itza probably gives us the best sense of how significant this was. In addition to being this kind of replaying of the story of the hero twins and of the ordering of the sun and fighting against the powers of darkness in the underworld, it was also the symbol of renewal and life. And the sense of life and death is written right on the stones. Here you can see the ball has a skull glyph right on it. This is a little bit hard to see, but when you take a look at it here, you can see the skull glyph here. You have the ball players, and this ball player actually has a head in his hand. You see that? It's really kind of gruesome. He has a knife in one hand and a head in the other. The other people are carrying around hand weights, which they might have used to strike the ball, but I think mostly those would have just been used to give them momentum so they can leap and jump and get up to hit the ball. And here is one of the players, and you can see that his head has been decapitated, and we have blood personified as serpents. Again, anything that wriggles or moves, blood is often serpents, spurting from his neck. But we also have a gourd, and the gourd comes out and into full blossoms. So, again, when you played the ball game, I know that in the Road to El Dorado they showed it was the losers who were sacrificed, but the truth is that we have just as much evidence to suggest it was the winners who were sacrificed, that these were warriors who were playing this game, and it was a great honor. And just as the hero twins gave their lives repeatedly and gave the blood to create mankind and set the universe in order, so too we had to be willing to give our lives in order to keep the universe going in order. Now, I was planning on talking about some pre-classic sites, but I've already dragged this lecture out to 1 hour and 30 minutes. And I'm losing my voice. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop it there, and we'll move the pre-classic stuff over to the next week's lecture and talk about the pre-classic sites with the classic sites. Otherwise, I'm just not going to make it. It would take me another half hour to lecture through that, and my voice would be toast. So, thanks so much for hanging in there. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.